As I sat down in my physical anthropology class in my junior year of college at a state university in Minnesota, I noticed up on the podium at the front of the classroom a big Bible. And I thought, well, that's kind of strange. A minute later, Dr. McClovic walked into the room. He walked up to the podium, opened that Bible, and he read a portion of the creation account in Genesis. And then he closed the Bible, and he looked intently at all of us around the room, and he said, "That's not the way it happened." And then he proceeded with much mockery and laughter, and the whole class joined in to dismantle everything that I embraced with regard to the beginning of life and its development in this world. And so my downward spiral into despair began. It wasn't only that class. My cultural anthropology classes taught me that religious faith was simply a socially constructed reality that enables humans to cope in a world where we have questions beyond our knowledge. My sociology classes convinced me that postmodern relativism was absolutely correct, and so that we had no access to objective truth. We only had our own truth as we saw it through our own lenses. And I continued to slide into despair. Because of that experience, I became a skeptic. In fact, I like to tell my students, as Faith Jean just said, that I was bitten by the secular snake in college, and that venom still runs in my veins. My hunch is that several of you have come into this room today who are struggling with skepticism. Some of you may actually have walked away from the faith. I've had students do that while they've been here. Others become very mired in questions that they have begun to wrestle with. And I would expect many more of you at some point, many of you after you leave Biola, you're going to run into this very difficult time. What do you do when your faith is shaken? What do you do when the world that you have taken as certain and you've ordered all of your perspective according to that faith is shaken to its core? Well, that's why I absolutely value my brother Thomas, and even more, the Jesus who pursued him in his doubt. When you take a look at Thomas, I want you to realize the weightiness of his objection. He said, "Unless I see the nail marks in his hands, unless I put my finger where the nails were, I will not believe." Why is that so great of an obstacle to faith? Well, it's because Jesus died. He knew what had happened to Jesus. He knew what the Romans did to convicted traitors to the state. He knew that all of the hopes regarding his messiahship were now wrapped up in his grave clothes in that stone sepulcher. In Thomas's mind now, he was a crucified fake. Supporting that are all of the unfulfilled prophecies that clearly had been rumbling around in their minds as they followed Jesus during those years. Prophecies like this: "Ask me, and I will make the nations your inheritance, the ends of the earth your possession. You will break them with a rod of iron. You will dash them to pieces like pottery," from Psalm chapter 2. Not only did Jesus not do this, but he was actually crucified by the very power they were expecting him to overthrow. As a result, he could not believe. So strong was that even though his fellow disciples gave him their passionate testimony, he was unconvinced. Well, I would suggest to you that your objections, those of you who are wrestling with faith or will eventually wrestle with faith, are also very weighty. Some of them might be intellectual. You're a scientist. You've wrestled now with genetics. You've wrestled with all kinds of scientific theories that just leave God out of the picture completely. In fact, the more you learn about the physical world, the biological world, the less you're convinced that there can actually be a God. Maybe it's you've been exposed to various perspectives in your reading, in podcasts that you've listened to, friends that you've interacted with, and you're an intellectual. You're an intellectual, and it's very, very difficult now to square your Christian faith with the things that you have come to believe. Some of you have been hurt. Some of you have been hurt by the church, by people who bear the name of Christ. Some people close to you have been hurt significantly. And that pain is real. That pain is very, very real. And it stands as an obstacle. And some of you are wrestling with moral disagreements with the positions that the church takes, positions that Scripture takes on certain issues that are really, really important to you, or even positions that simply the church seems to take regardless of what Scripture says. Things like climate, things like immigration, things like race, things like sexuality and gender. These are really weighty issues. They're really weighty issues, and they can stand as dramatic obstacles to continuing to believe in Jesus. And I just want you to know, I share some of these. Well, when Jesus appeared to the 10, John tells us that Thomas wasn't there. And the text tells us that when Jesus appears to them, he showed them his hands, he showed them his side. And so when they then talked to Thomas later, obviously they included that. We saw him. We saw the places where the nails were. And yet Thomas was very, very stubborn in his skepticism. Unless I see myself the nails, where the nails were. Thomas demanded to go to the right place. He demanded to go to Jesus himself. Now, you'll remember my objections to faith. Let me unpack them maybe more succinctly. Jesus had become just another perspective in my mind. If everyone is limited to their lens and their apprehension of truth, that includes also Jesus. And so he became just one of the many religious gurus in the history of the world who claimed to know the answers to the questions that we just can't quite know the answers to. But I also had become very disillusioned by the church. You see, during those weeks and months where I was sliding further and further into despair, I made several trips home to my hometown to see my parents, but also to have conversations with people that I had learned the faith from, people that I respected, people that I trusted. And I began to start letting them know the things I was wrestling with. And all I got were a bunch of sermons. All I got were condescending remarks about why I should not be thinking this way. And all that did to me is that it convinced me that these people had never really wrestled with the questions. They didn't know how difficult these questions really were. And so the church went from a place of honor and respect to a place of disrespect and dismissal. Why should I believe the answers that they had given me for these questions when these people didn't even know how difficult the questions were? By March, I had become an agnostic. I had given up on the faith. I had become very much non-committal about anything. And I was fast becoming an atheist. And the more I slid into this state of mind and state of faith, because it is faith, the more I fell into despair. How can this world that seems to have so much meaning be meaningless? So that it's going nowhere, and it came from nowhere. My life ultimately does not matter, and nothing matters. I came to the point where I wasn't sure I could actually live in this kind of world. And so, in my last desperate Hail Mary, I reached out to a former pastor of mine. I remembered that he had gone to the University of Minnesota. I'm from Minnesota. And I thought, well, he must have run into some things like what I'm wrestling with. So I asked him if I could take him out for lunch. So he said yes. I drove home, and we met for lunch, and I laid out what I was dealing with. And he listened, and he asked questions, and he listened some more. He was the first one who listened. He was the only one. I'm here today because of him. He listened to me, and then he gave me a challenge, a book, and a tape. His challenge was this: sooner or later, you'll have to deal with the person of Jesus Christ. Well, initially, that was really disappointing, because I had been there and done that. I had been raised in the church. I even had taken a year off to go to Bible college. What in the world was that all about? I was wrestling with the big questions. Well, then he gave me this book and a tape, and he sent me on my way. That's essentially what he did with me. I had long since quit reading the scriptures, and so I began to read this book. It was a book of collected sermons by a German theologian. And I'll never forget the night. I was lying on my lumpy little single bed in my apartment, and I was reading this book, and I came to this line: that we must come to the point when we realize that the truth for which we seek does not lie in some philosophical or theological thought, but in a person, Jesus Christ. I remember looking up from my bed, and the words of my former pastor just came echoing back. Sooner or later, you're going to have to deal with the person of Jesus Christ. And the question immediately came into my mind: what had I missed? What had I missed? Well, let me give you a challenge as well. I want to encourage you to go to the right place. Go to the right place with your objections. Because it took me a long time to realize that Thomas was right. You need to go to Jesus. You need to wrestle with him. Now, going to him is not necessarily obvious, because it is so easy for us to identify Jesus with the church. It's awfully easy to identify Jesus with people who bear his name, who have lived poorly, who may have hurt you, who may have done things that are offensive to you. And it's really difficult to separate those two things. Or even the scriptures. The church and the scriptures are not Jesus. You need to go to him, because Jesus is ground zero. Well, John tells us that a week later, Jesus appeared again to the disciples, and this time Thomas was with them. And Jesus invited him. He pursued him. He said, "Put your fingers here. See my hands. Reach out your hand and put it into my side. Stop doubting and believe." Thomas responds. We don't even know if Thomas touched him. The text doesn't tell us. All we have is Thomas' now response, and it's extravagant. He said, "My Lord and my God." Now, why in the world did he go so far beyond my Lord, my King, my Lord, my Messiah? He went all the way to my God. This is one of the most elevated Christological statements in Scripture. Why? Well, I think the answer is you have to go back a few chapters in John to a conversation that Jesus was having with his disciples, and Thomas and Philip are engaging Jesus. Prior conversation. And notice what Philip says: "Lord, show us the Father, and that will be enough for us." Jesus responds, "Don't you know me, Philip? Anyone who has seen me has seen the Father." That means that when Jesus appears to Thomas and invites him in this undeniably physical way to touch him, to confirm that he's the guy who was crucified a few days ago, that experience overwhelmed Thomas and validated not just that he was alive from the dead, but that everything that Jesus had claimed was true. Because if this guy rose from the dead after being cruelly crucified, that meant there was a God. And that meant that that God had identified this guy in this historical event as the one that he needed to listen to. And so that claim that if you've seen me, you've seen the Father, is now confirmed by the resurrection, and he responds. The result is the resolution of Thomas's objections to faith. The crucified fake now was demonstrated to be the one who was raised from the dead. And this wasn't theology. This wasn't subjective opinion. This wasn't some sort of interpretation of Scripture. It was an event. And it was the kind of event that changed the world. It was the kind of event that validated who this guy was in an objective way. So much so that now when he thought back to the unfulfilled prophecies or the unconvincing witnesses of his fellow disciples, now they needed to be reassessed in light of the event of the resurrection. But don't move too quickly past this text, because Jesus, I think, is also rebuking Thomas. Remember, he says, stop doubting and believe. And then he goes on to give this blessing. Because you have seen me, you have believed. Blessed are those who have not seen and yet have believed. What I think is going on here is that Jesus is implying something. He's implying that Thomas should have been the first one to believe on the basis of the fellow disciples' testimony to the risen Christ, and to believe without seeing. So I think there is actually a rebuke here. Thomas should have been the first one to represent the long line of Christians who would come to believe on the basis of the transformed lives of his fellow disciples. They were wrestling with the greatest obstacle to faith that you could ever have. They had seen this man die, impaled on a Roman cross, and now they were transformed. It should have been enough for Thomas. Jesus pursued me as well. What had I missed? You remember my objections to faith. Jesus was one perspective, and I was disillusioned by the church. I realized there was no way past these. The more I wrestled with them, the more I was stuck. I couldn't know, just from my perspective, whether Jesus actually was the one who understood everything, that he knew the right answers. And obviously built within that was the whole biblical worldview that addressed my scientific objections. And I was really disillusioned by the church. They were a bunch of naive, non-thinking, non-critical, credulous people. What was I to do? I needed a place to stand. I'll never forget the moment, the spot that I was at when I had my Thomas moment. I was walking out of my little apartment bedroom, and I was heading toward our little kitchenette, and in that hallway between, the thought came to me, what if Jesus rose from the dead? In a way that I'd never thought of before. What difference would that make? And as I began to start thinking about that, I realized that my objections were really grounded in an unspoken assumption, and that is that Jesus was a crucified fake. Because I was dealing with these questions because I didn't actually take seriously, in a critical way, that Jesus was raised. And so I began then to start wrestling again with the question of the resurrection in a way I'd never done before. Now, as an unbeliever, as an agnostic, as a person who was priding myself in my critical thinking, and I needed to be convinced. And so I began to wrestle with the resurrection and the evidence and the sort of things that point in the direction of its reality. And I was coming to the place of realizing that it probably did actually happen. And I was wrestling now with the fact that it was an event, which was not subjectivity, it was not interpretation, it wasn't opinion. But what was I going to do with the church? So I didn't want to be a Christian now. I didn't want to be one of those unthinking, naive people that the world laughed at. Well, about that time, I remembered that my former pastor had also given me that tape, and I didn't know it was on the tape. It was a little cassette tape. This goes all the way back to the 80s. And so I waited until my roommates had gone for the evening. And I turned all the apartment lights off. It was completely black in the apartment, I think matching my soul. And I put that tape in the tape deck, and I sat in the silence and in the darkness, and I listened to an old pastor preach about the treasure hidden in the field. And he talked about the various things that people, once they encounter the kingdom, once they encounter the character of the king who reigns, the things that they sell. Things like the pursuit of money, the pursuit of pleasure, the pursuit of power and influence. And he said, I don't want to talk about any of those things. I want to talk about intellectual arrogance. Pow, right between the eyes. I actually don't remember anything else that sermon actually included. But by the end, I was on my knees. I was on my knees because now Jesus wasn't just one perspective, he was the authority. And I was reconciled to the church. Not because the church had changed, but because I realized that this was what Jesus was building. And even though the church was failing in so many ways, they were the people of Jesus. And so I became reconciled to them. In the end, Jesus was greater than my skepticism through Thomas and the 10. I didn't have access to the risen Christ, but I did have access to what happened for those men as they encountered the risen Christ, whose objections to faith were far more significant than mine. And that was enough for me. And that's where I've stood all these years. Will Jesus be greater than your skepticism? Remember Jesus' last words. Because you have seen me, you have believed. Blessed are those who have not seen and yet have believed. I think what Jesus is implying is that those who follow the apostolic period have a greater challenge to believe. Your challenges to faith are many. You have these intellectual issues, you have issues with the church, you have issues with pain, you have issues with the scriptural stance on things. These are weighty, but they're not the most important objections. My hunch is if you stay and wrestle with these and all you do is that, you most likely are not going to remain as a Christian because you don't have enough knowledge to know what is actually right. You must understand that you've got to deal with the crucified man. So don't let yourself get so sidetracked into these other issues and think those are the important ones. They're very important, but this one is more important. My prayer, of course, is that you will experience the same thing that I did, that as you wrestle now critically and seriously, looking for truth about that last one, that you will actually discover that there's a whole lot of good reasons to believe. You're not going to come to certainty. Let me pop that bubble right now. You're not going to come to certainty. That's not faith. Faith is embracing something that you finally can't prove, but it's not naive. It's critically informed. And it's grounded in the resurrection of Jesus. And if you come there, I believe then you will be at a place where you can stand and reassess these other things. My prayer, of course, is that will happen for you. When Jesus met his disciples the first time, as well as the second time with Thomas, he led with these words, "Peace be with you. Peace be with you." We could spend an awful lot of time unpacking what that means. Think about the lives of these disciples. From this point forward, they were going to be going into an antagonistic world, both in the Jewish world and then eventually in the Gentile world, declaring something that was incredibly difficult to believe, incredibly offensive to the Roman Empire, incredibly offensive to their Jewish comrades. And they were going to pay for this testimony dearly, most of whom were martyred. But they did so with that promise, grounded in the resurrection, grounded in the fact that not only was he raised from the dead, but that his death on the cross was redeeming. And as a result, they could navigate this very, very difficult world. I would encourage you to realize that there's hope for the skeptic. You don't have to live your life mired in agnosticism, mired in the uncertainty of this world, mired in the difficulty of the questions. If you find in Jesus your risen King, you will find a place to stand. You'll find a place where you can actually engage those questions in a way that you never did before. But when you do, I want to remind you that what that event does is it validates Jesus' authority on everything. It validates Jesus' authority as the authority of God himself. And so as you then now reassess these questions, make sure you do so with a knee bent to the authority of Jesus. And if you do, I think you will discover that life has meaning. Our world is careening out of control right now. And I'm sure many of you are deeply troubled by what's going on. And what does the future hold? I don't know, but I know who holds the future. And I know that it's going somewhere. And I know he is not just the creator and sustainer, but he is the redeemer. And one day, he will call you forth. From the dust of death, he will call you forth, just like Jesus' own body. And he will take you to himself forever. That is my prayer for you. That as you go on until that day comes, that you will live life living in the reality of the risen Christ saying, "Peace be with you."
Discover who you're called to be at Biola University, a leading Christ-centered university in Los Angeles, with programs on campus and online. Subscribe for more of our videos and learn more at biola.edu.